Richard stared at the hotel receipt in his trembling hands, the same anniversary suite where he'd surprised Margaret after her recovery, now booked on a Tuesday when she was supposedly at book club. After 35 years of engineering precision and unwavering loyalty, including the 3 years he'd nursed her through cancer treatments, Richard recognized patterns when he saw them. The text messages on her forgotten tablet confirmed what the receipt suggested. Margaret and her younger co-worker, Jason, had been meeting for months, laughing about old reliable while planning their next rendezvous. What gutted him wasn't just the betrayal, but the location. They deliberately desecrated the memories of their 30th anniversary celebration. When you've given decades to someone who discards your devotion for a fleeting thrill, the path forward isn't about revenge, it's about reclaiming your dignity. Richard closed the tablet, his engineer's mind already assembling a different kind of blueprint, one that would ensure consequences perfectly proportional to their betrayal. Richard Adams straightened his tie before the bathroom mirror, a habit of 35 years that hadn't faded despite today being his final workday. The reflection showed a man of 62 with steel gray hair, still fit from weekend golf and twice-weekly tennis, lines at his eyes that Margaret called wisdom markers in happier days. "Big day," she said, appearing in the doorway in her bathrobe, coffee mug in hand. "How does it feel?" "Like completing a project on schedule," Richard replied, the engineer in him preferring precision to sentimentality. 35 years, 312 projects, and now the drafting table is clear. Margaret smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "And then what? Fishing trips and golf?" "Then us," he said, gesturing toward the travel brochures on the dresser. "Scotland in May, remember? You've always wanted to see the Highlands." "So predictable," she murmured, turning back toward the kitchen. "Always a plan, always on schedule." Richard watched her go, a flicker of unease settling in his chest. Predictability had built their lives, his steady income allowing her to complete her degree, his careful financial planning creating their security. When had reliability become a liability? At his retirement gathering, colleagues toasted his precision, his integrity, his mentorship. His boss recalled the Westfield project saved by Richard's attention to detail. Young engineers thanked him for guidance. Through it all, he watched Margaret across the room, animated in conversation with the marketing team, looking more engaged than she had in months. One young executive in particular, Jason Miller, he recalled from introductions, leaned too close when speaking to her. Richard dismissed the observation. Margaret was naturally sociable. He'd always admired that about her. "To Richard Adams," announced Thomas Fletcher, CEO of Meridian Engineering, raising his glass at the retirement dinner. "The man who taught us all that precision isn't just about measurements, but about integrity." Applause rippled through the private dining room. Richard nodded in acknowledgement, a man more comfortable with schematics than spotlights. Margaret squeezed his hand under the table, but her attention drifted repeatedly to her left, where Jason Miller held court with younger staff members. "Did you hear about the Fisher account?" Jason asked Margaret, leaning closer than necessary. "We're implementing that strategy you suggested. The old guard was resistant, but some fresh thinking is exactly what we needed." Margaret beamed. "That's wonderful. It's about time someone listened." Richard sipped his water, feeling suddenly irrelevant. Margaret had worked in administrative roles at Meridian for 15 years, but recently had moved into project coordination. She seemed to be thriving, while he was exiting. "So what's the plan now, Richard?" asked Jason, turning toward him with polished charm that didn't reach his eyes. Golf courses and rocking chairs? Travel, primarily, Richard answered evenly. Margaret and I have plans. That's the problem with you boomers, Jason laughed, though no one had made a joke. Retiring too slowly, then taking up all the good travel spots. Several younger colleagues chuckled. Margaret joined them, a laugh that sounded foreign to Richard's ears. Marriage is like a life sentence, Jason continued, raising his glass in mock toast. Good behavior only gets you weekends off, right? Margaret laughed again, too enthusiastically. Richard's fork paused halfway to his mouth as he watched his wife of 35 years wipe tears of mirth from her eyes at a joke about marriage as imprisonment. The drive home was quiet. Margaret's phone chirped repeatedly with text notifications. Quite popular tonight, Richard observed. Just work, she replied, not looking up. The Fisher project, Jason mentioned. Richard nodded, focusing on the road ahead. After decades in engineering, he'd learned that small discrepancies often signaled larger structural problems, but he wasn't ready to inspect this particular foundation just yet. 3 weeks into retirement, Richard sat in his home office organizing their tax documents. The quiet satisfaction of ordered files and balanced accounts had always centered him. Outside, he could hear Margaret on the phone in the kitchen, her voice dropping when he approached to refill his coffee. Just book club details, she explained, tucking her phone into her pocket. We're starting a new novel Thursday. Book club? Richard asked. When did you join a book club? Last month. I mentioned it. Susan from accounting hosts it. Margaret brushed past him, opening the refrigerator. I need something of my own now that you're home all the time. Richard nodded slowly. Had she mentioned it? Perhaps his attention had slipped during the transition to retirement. That evening he noticed Margaret's careful attention to her appearance before leaving. A new blouse he didn't recognize, more makeup than usual for meeting friends. The subtle floral scent was her special occasion perfume, not her everyday choice. You look nice, he observed. Must be a special book. Susan likes us to make an effort, she replied, checking her reflection. Don't wait up. These discussions can run late. After she left, Richard wandered through their home of 30 years, feeling strangely displaced. In the bedroom, he noticed Margaret's tablet on her nightstand. She typically guarded her devices closely these days, a new password on her phone that she explained as work security requirements, though she'd never needed one before. He sat down heavily on the bed, thinking of their neighbor Tom, also recently retired, who spent his days volunteering and traveling with his wife. They seemed to have transitioned smoothly into this new chapter. Why did Richard feel like he was reading a different book entirely from Margaret? Returning to his tax organization, he methodically reviewed credit card statements, his engineer's precision noting each expenditure. His finger stopped at an unfamiliar charge. The Grand Hotel downtown, dated 2 weeks ago. Tuesday evening. Book club night. Richard stared at the entry, the quiet ticking of his desk clock suddenly thunderous in the silence of the house. The Grand Hotel, Richard said the next morning, sliding the credit card statement across the breakfast table. Tuesday night. That's not on our usual statements. Margaret's coffee cup paused midway to her lips. Her eyes flicked to the paper, then up to his face. A moment of calculation, visible before her expression, softened into confusion. The Grand, oh, that. She set her cup down carefully. That was a work expense. I must have used the wrong card. Jason and I had to meet with the Fisher client. I'll get reimbursed. On a Tuesday evening? During your book club? Margaret sighed, a flash of irritation crossing her face. There was no book club that week. I told you it was canceled. Don't you remember? Richard hesitated. Had she mentioned that? He prided himself on attention to detail, yet lately he felt off balance. Uncertain of conversations he'd previously been confident had never occurred. "And this client meeting was at the hotel restaurant?" he pressed. "Richard, what is this? An interrogation?" Margaret pushed back from the table. "Yes, at the restaurant." The client picked the location. "I'm sorry about the card mix-up, but it's hardly a federal case. I don't recall you mentioning a canceled book club." Margaret's expression shifted from irritation to concern. "This isn't the first time you've forgotten things I've told you. I'm starting to worry about you. My father started showing memory issues around your age." "My memory is fine," Richard said firmly. "Is it? Because you've been increasingly forgetful since retirement. Maybe you should see Dr. Winters. It could be stress from the transition, or—" She let the sentence hang, implication clear. Richard felt a cold weight settling in his stomach. Was he forgetting things? Or was Margaret rewriting their reality? "I'll think about it," he conceded, unwilling to continue a conversation that was making him doubt his own mind. "Good," Margaret said, squeezing his shoulder as she passed. "I'm concerned about you." That's all. As she left the kitchen, Richard stared at the credit card statement, engineer's mind already formulating a new approach to this problem. If something was structurally unsound, you didn't just question it, you tested it systematically. In his home office, Richard created what he would have called a discrepancy log at work. He noted the hotel charge, the new password, the book club nights. He pulled up their shared calendar app, where Margaret had dutifully marked book club at Susan's, 7 p.m. on recurring Thursday evenings. Next, he opened the family tracking app they'd installed years ago when their daughter Catherine was in college, a safety measure they'd never disabled. Margaret's location on Thursday evenings showed her at an address that wasn't Susan's home. Richard searched the address, the Grand Hotel. 4 book club nights, 4 visits to the hotel. He leaned back in his chair, a hollow feeling expanding in his chest. 35 years of marriage, and now this methodical cataloging of his wife's deceptions. That afternoon, Richard visited Joe's barber shop, a monthly ritual unchanged by retirement. "The usual trim?" Joe asked, draping the cape around Richard's shoulders. "The usual everything, it seems," Richard replied, "except for what isn't." Joe met his eyes in the mirror. "Retirement blues? Takes adjustment, I hear." "Adjustment, yes." Richard hesitated. "Joe, you cut hair for half the executives at Meridian. Ever hear anything about a Jason Miller in marketing?" Joe's hands paused momentarily before continuing. "Ambitious fellow, good-looking, if you like that polished type. Bit of a reputation." "Reputation?" "With the ladies at the office." Joe's voice lowered. "Word is he's working his way up the corporate ladder horizontally, if you catch my meaning." Richard nodded slowly. "And my wife? Margaret? Ever hear her name connected with his?" Joe's scissors stopped. Their eyes met in the mirror again, and Richard saw the answer before Joe spoke. "Rich, I'm sorry. There have been comments. Seen together at lunch too often. Working late when nobody else is. I didn't want to be the one to—" "It's all right," Richard interrupted. "Just confirming a theory." Joe squeezed his shoulder. "For what it's worth, I think you're worth 10 of him. Margaret's making a fool's bargain if what they're saying is true." On the drive home, Richard felt strangely calm. In engineering, identifying the problem was half the solution. Now he knew what he was dealing with. The question was what to do with this information. That night, after Margaret left for another book club meeting, Richard sat in their darkened bedroom, staring at her tablet on the nightstand. She'd taken her phone, but in her haste had forgotten the tablet. Unlike her phone, it didn't appear to be password protected. He hesitated, 35 years of respecting each other's privacy, warring with the mounting evidence of betrayal. But if a building showed signs of structural failure, you didn't ignore them out of politeness. You investigated before collapse. Richard picked up the tablet. The screen illuminated, displaying Margaret's email. He felt a moment's relief. Perhaps this was all a misunderstanding. Then a notification banner slid down from the top of the screen. Jason. Missing you already. Can't wait for Tuesday at our special place. Old reliable still clueless? The message preview ended there, but it was enough. Richard tapped the notification, opening a messaging app he didn't recognize. The full conversation loaded, and he found himself staring at months of exchanges between his wife and her younger colleague. The texts were explicit, detailing encounters and plans, but what cut deepest were the casual cruelties. He's planning another boring Scotland trip. As if I want to look at rocks and old castles with an even older husband. Old reliable is so predictable. Home by 6, asleep by 10, leaves plenty of time for us. The best part about using our anniversary hotel, he'd never suspect I'd be so disrespectful of his precious memories. Too poetic for Mr. Practical to imagine. Richard scrolled through message after message, each one another blow. 7 months of deception. Plans made and executed while he prepared for retirement, while he cared for her, while he planned their future. Most devastating was the realization that several of their friends knew. Susan was actively covering for them, suggesting restaurants where they wouldn't be recognized. A particularly cruel exchange about his retirement party left him struggling to breathe, a tightness in his chest that momentarily felt like a heart attack. He set the tablet down, moving to the window for air. In that moment, standing in the darkness of the bedroom they'd shared for decades, Richard Adams made a decision. This wouldn't be a confrontation born of emotion. This would be a calculated response worthy of his engineering mind. First, he needed more information, and possibly an ally. Pre-dawn light filtered through the bedroom curtains as Richard continued his systematic review of Margaret's tablet. He'd spent hours documenting every message, every plan, every mockery. His notepad filled with dates, times, and details, his handwriting remaining precise despite the tremor he felt inside. The messages revealed a timeline more extensive than he'd initially thought. While the physical affair had begun 7 months ago, the flirtation stretched back nearly a year, beginning shortly after Margaret's 5-year cancer-free celebration. The very milestone Richard had supported her through with unwavering dedication now seemed like a cruel demarcation. Survival achieved, loyalty discarded. Most gutting were the messages about their anniversary hotel. 3 months ago, Jason had written, "Where should we meet next week?" Margaret had responded, "The Grand, Suite 1214. "Isn't that where you and Mr. Excitement stay on your anniversary?" Exactly. Poetic justice for all the boring anniversaries I've endured. Plus, he'd never suspect I'd be so disrespectful to his precious memories. Too sentimental for his practical mind to imagine. Richard's chest constricted again as he read the exchange. Suite 1214, where he'd surprised Margaret on their 30th anniversary after her recovery, where they'd renewed their vows in a private ceremony, where he'd promised to love her through whatever challenges lay ahead. The text continued, revealing plans for their future. Jason was up for promotion to marketing director in the annual review cycle next month. Once approved, their relationship would no longer violate company policy against supervisor-subordinate relationships. They planned to go public afterward, What about Richard? Jason had asked. He'll be devastated, but he'll survive, Margaret had replied. He's got his retirement fund and his golf. I deserve some excitement after all these years. Richard set the tablet down, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The physical symptoms of emotional trauma, he thought clinically, trying to distance himself from the pain. He moved to the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face. In the mirror, he saw a man he barely recognized, pale, shaken, diminished. No, he whispered to his reflection. This isn't how this story ends. More coffee? Margaret asked, holding the pot over Richard's cup at breakfast. Please, he replied, surprising himself with how normal his voice sounded. Had she always been this skilled at deception, or had he recently developed the ability as well? She poured, then sat across from him, scrolling through her phone. Book club tonight, she said without looking up. Susan picked another thriller. Not really my taste, but the discussion should be lively. Richard nodded, studying her. The woman he'd loved for 35 years, now a stranger performing a role. Had she always resented their life together, or was this a recent development? Had cancer's survival sparked some desperate grasp at youth and excitement? I was thinking, he said carefully, maybe I could meet you afterward for a late dinner. That new Italian place near Susan's. Margaret glanced up, momentary alarm quickly masked by a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Oh, these meetings run late, unpredictable. Better if we just see each other at home. Of course, just a thought. You could call Tom about that fishing trip he mentioned, she suggested. Might be good for you to get out more, develop retirement interests. Retirement interests, Richard repeated. Yes, I should focus on that. I worry about you, Margaret said, reaching for his hand with practiced concern. All these years, your work defined you. Now you seem adrift. The irony wasn't lost on him, her pretense of concern while she planned her escape. Yet looking at her now, makeup carefully applied at 7:30 a.m., special occasion perfume already detectable, he recognized the Margaret he'd first fallen in love with, vibrant, engaged, alive. The difference was that her energy was no longer directed toward their shared life, but toward deception. Will you wear your blue tie to Catherine's engagement dinner Saturday? She asked, changing subjects. It brings out your eyes. Our daughter's happiness matters to you. The question slipped out before he could stop it. Margaret froze. What kind of question is that? Of course it does. Just checking, Richard said mildly. Sometimes I wonder what still matters to you. She studied him, calculation visible behind her eyes. You're acting strangely lately. I really think you should see Dr. Winters. I'll call today, he agreed, knowing he never would. By the way, could you pick up my blood pressure medication this afternoon? I'd do it, but I'm meeting Tom for lunch. Of course, she said, visibly relieved by his acquiescence and the return to mundane matters. The pharmacy on Cedar Street? Richard nodded, a plan already forming. Yes, thank you. The pharmacy on Cedar Street was busier than usual for a Thursday afternoon. Richard stood in line at the prescription counter, checking his watch. Margaret had texted that she'd dropped off his prescription, but had a work emergency and couldn't wait. Another convenient lie. Adams? Called the pharmacist. Richard stepped forward, accepting the white paper bag. As he turned to leave, he collided with a woman entering the prescription line. I'm sorry, he apologized automatically, steadying her with a gentle hand on her arm. My fault, she replied, her voice tired, not watching where I was going. Richard took a step back, truly seeing her now. A woman perhaps a few years younger than himself, attractive in a natural way that required no enhancement, but with shadows under her eyes suggesting recent sleepless nights, Something about her seemed vaguely familiar. "Do I know you?" he asked, then immediately regretted the cliché. She smiled faintly. "I don't think so. I'm Elaine Miller." The name hit Richard like a physical blow. Miller, Jason Miller's wife. "Richard Adams," he responded automatically. Recognition dawned in her eyes as well. "Adams? Your wife works with my husband at Meridian?" "Yes," Richard confirmed, suddenly understanding her exhausted appearance. Did she know? Was he looking into a mirror of his own pain? "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "You seem tired," she finished for him. "Just tired. I haven't been sleeping well." Around them, the pharmacy continued its business, customers moving through lines, pharmacists calling names, life proceeding normally while two people stood frozen in a moment of potential revelation. "Would you like to get coffee?" Richard asked suddenly. "There's a shop next door." Elaine hesitated, studying his face. Something she saw there, recognition perhaps of shared circumstance, made her nod. "I think that might be a good idea," she said. "I'm here for sleeping pills, but maybe conversation would be more helpful." As they walked together toward the coffee shop, Richard felt an odd sense of fate. In all his careful planning as an engineer, he'd never accounted for coincidence. Yet here was a potential ally he hadn't sought, but perhaps desperately needed, someone who understood exactly what he was facing. "Your wife works with my husband Jason," Elaine said, as they settled at a corner table, her tone making it clear this wasn't a casual observation. "Yes," Richard replied simply. "I believe they know each other quite well." Their eyes met in perfect understanding. No further explanation was necessary. "How long have you known?" Elaine asked, wrapping her hands around a mug of black coffee. "Confirmed it yesterday," Richard replied. "Suspected for weeks. You?" 3 days. Found hotel receipts. Then checked his messages while he was showering." She took a sip, grimacing at the bitterness. 26 years of marriage. I thought I knew him." Richard nodded, understanding completely. 35 years for us. What gave it away for you? Engineering mindset. Small discrepancies compound until you can't ignore the structural problem. Richard hesitated, then added, "The worst part was discovering they've been meeting at the hotel where Margaret and I celebrated our 30th anniversary." Elaine winced. "That's particularly cruel." "Deliberately so, according to her messages." Richard tapped his fingers on the table, a habit from his working days when analyzing a problem. "The affair has been physical for 7 months, emotional for longer." Same timeline for Jason. Elaine pushed her coffee aside. "Did you know this isn't his first workplace relationship? Before Margaret, there was someone at his previous company. It's a pattern for him, pursuing older, established women who can help his career." Richard looked up sharply. "Margaret's on the promotion committee for marketing director." "Exactly." Elaine's mouth set in a grim line. "Jason's up for review next month. Once approved, he won't be her supervisor anymore, removing the company policy violation." "They're planning to go public after the promotion," Richard confirmed. "Of course they are." Elaine's laugh held no humor. "My husband is nothing if not strategic. He wouldn't risk his career until the paperwork was signed." They sat in silence for a moment, two strangers united by betrayal, trying to process the collision of their lives. "What will you do?" Elaine finally asked. Richard considered the question. What had he planned before this unexpected meeting? Confrontation? Divorce? Simple surrender? "I'm not sure yet," he admitted, "but I know I won't just walk away from 35 years with nothing but my dignity." "No," Elaine agreed, a new resolve entering her voice. Neither will I. I should mention, Elaine said, as they moved to a more private table in the coffee shop's corner, my background is in corporate compliance. Before I scaled back to raise our children, I oversaw policy enforcement for a Fortune 500 company. Richard raised an eyebrow, reassessing the woman across from him, not just a betrayed spouse, but a strategist in her own right. That could be useful, he acknowledged. Meridian has strict policies about supervisor-subordinate relationships. Jason is Margaret's direct supervisor, which makes their relationship a clear violation, Elaine confirmed. Grounds for termination in most companies, especially if company resources were used to facilitate the affair, such as falsified client meetings, company-paid hotel expenses. Richard pulled out his notepad. I've documented several instances. You've been thorough, Elaine observed, impressed by his methodical approach. Engineer, Richard explained simply. I assess structural weaknesses for a living. Or did until retirement. He hesitated, then added, I should mention that I maintained a separate investment account my grandfather started. Margaret doesn't know about it. It's not an attempt to hide marital assets. I've always intended it for our grandchildren, but it gives me some financial independence she isn't expecting. Smart, Elaine nodded. Jason controls most of our finances. He'd be surprised to learn I've maintained my own accounts as well. A tentative plan began taking shape between them, not born of vengeance, but of self-preservation and accountability. The company ethics violation is our strongest point, Elaine noted. If reported to HR before his promotion review, the timing would need to be precise, Richard agreed. Too early, and they might issue only a warning. Too late, and he'll no longer be her supervisor. Meanwhile, we should secure our respective financial positions, Elaine continued. Not to be vindictive, but to protect what we've worked for. Richard nodded, feeling more centered than he had in weeks. I know an excellent financial advisor. Discreet, ethical, but thorough. And I know exactly how to document an ethics violation that will stick, Elaine added. I'll need evidence, though. I have access to Margaret's tablet messages. And perhaps, Richard considered, I might have another resource. My former colleague David is now head of security at Meridian. Badge access records, email server logs. Perfect, Elaine said, her professional demeanor briefly giving way to emotion. I can't tell you what it means to have an ally in this. I've felt so isolated, so foolish. Not foolish, Richard corrected gently. Betrayed. There's a difference. Evening approached as Richard and Elaine sat in his car, parked in a quiet corner of the coffee shop lot. On the dashboard between them lay their shared calendar app, where they'd begun mapping out a timeline. Margaret's assistant, Kim, might be helpful, Elaine suggested. I've met her at company functions. She seemed uncomfortable around Jason. She may have been scheduling their fake client meetings, Richard agreed. Possibly unwittingly. I could approach her, Elaine offered. Woman to woman. Less intimidating than if you did it. Richard nodded, impressed by her strategic thinking. And I'll speak with David about the security records. We'll need concrete evidence for HR. They continued planning, methodically addressing each aspect: documentation gathering, financial protection, timing of the HR report. The approach was neither vengeful nor passive, simply a proportional response to deliberate harm. According to Margaret's messages, the promotion committee meets on the 15th, Richard noted. If we present to HR on the 12th, that's optimal timing. Agreed, Elaine said, adding it to their calendar. Jason comes home every day bragging about how the promotion is a done deal. The committee is just a formality. Because Margaret has influence there, Richard concluded. A clear conflict of interest on top of the policy violation. As they finalized their approach, Richard felt an unexpected sense of purpose. His retirement, which had seemed so empty days ago, now had a clear objective: not destruction, but restoration; not revenge, but accountability. "There's one more thing," Elaine said, hesitating. "After this is done, what then, for each of us?" Richard considered the question. "I can't speak for you, but for me, I want whatever comes next to be on my terms, not dictated by their betrayal." "That's it exactly," Elaine agreed. "I want my dignity back. And maybe," she smiled slightly, "a friend who understands what I've been through." "I think that can be arranged," Richard replied, returning her smile. "We've proven to be quite an effective team already." As he drove home, Richard reflected on the strange turn of events. In a single day, he'd found not just an ally, but someone who truly understood his pain and his desire for dignity rather than destruction. Whatever came next, he would face it with clear purpose and unexpected support. "The problem with late-life divorce," explained James Wilson, leaning forward across his desk, "is that it comes when your earning potential has peaked and your retirement resources are most vulnerable." Richard nodded, having anticipated this. James had been his financial advisor for 15 years, a relationship built on trust and shared values. "I'm not looking to punish Margaret financially," Richard clarified. "I just want to protect what I've built. Particularly the beach house. That was always meant for Catherine and future grandchildren." "Smart thinking," James approved, typing notes into his computer. "We can establish a trust for the property immediately. Technically, it's a joint asset, but given that it was purchased primarily with your inheritance from your parents, we have a strong case for keeping it separate from divorce proceedings." "And my retirement accounts?" "Trickier. Most will be considered marital property, subject to division." James paused, studying his screen. "However, I see Margaret has her own substantial 401k through Meridian. That helps your position." Richard hesitated, then shared what he'd discovered. "She's been researching divorce attorneys, specifically looking at how to maximize claims on my pension." James's eyebrows rose. "That changes things. When did you discover this?" "It was in her search history on the tablet. Multiple visits to websites about divorcing near retirement age, maximizing spousal support claims." "Documenting that was smart," James nodded. "Shows premeditation on her part, which can influence asset division." "I've documented everything," Richard confirmed. "The affair, the deception, the research on divorce. I'm building a case for the most reasonable separation possible." "And the separate investment account?" James asked. "The one your grandfather started?" "Margaret doesn't know about it. I've always kept it separate, intended for education funds for grandchildren." James considered this. "It predates the marriage and has never been commingled with joint funds. We have a good argument for keeping it separate. I'd recommend moving it into a formal trust structure immediately, just to be safe." As they continued reviewing his financial position, Richard felt a sense of security returning. He wasn't trying to punish Margaret or leave her destitute. He simply wanted to protect what he'd worked for and ensure his own future remained stable. "One last thing," James said as their meeting concluded. "Have you considered your health insurance? Currently, you're both on your retiree plan, correct?" Richard hadn't thought of this detail. Another example of how divorce at their age created unique complications. "I'll need to look into options for her. Despite everything, I wouldn't want her left without coverage." James nodded approvingly. "That speaks to your character, Richard. Not everyone would be so considerate in your position." "It's not about being considerate," Richard replied, gathering his documents. It's about maintaining my own standards, regardless of her actions. I really shouldn't be doing this, Kim said nervously, glancing around the quiet lunch spot Elaine had chosen, well away from Meridian's offices. I understand your position, Elaine replied calmly. And I appreciate you meeting me. I just need to confirm what I already suspect. Kim, Margaret's assistant for the past 3 years, was younger than Elaine had expected, perhaps early 30s, with an earnest expression that suggested honesty was her natural state. The discomfort evident in her fidgeting hands and darting eyes spoke volumes. I've been scheduling meetings that don't exist, Kim confessed quietly. Client appointments that aren't real, blocking time on their calendars when they're actually elsewhere. You were following your supervisor's instructions, Elaine said, keeping her tone non-judgmental. That's your job. But I knew, Kim insisted, her voice strained. Everyone knows. The way they look at each other in meetings, the private jokes, how they always leave together, it's obvious, and I've been helping facilitate it. Elaine leaned forward. Have you documented these fake meetings? Emails, calendar invites? Kim hesitated, then nodded. Everything goes through the system. Mr. Miller, Jason, he's not very careful. He sends messages from his work email that are inappropriate. And there are access logs showing them badging into the building after hours when no clients are present. Would you be willing to provide copies of those records? Kim looked down at her untouched salad. I could lose my job. Actually, Elaine countered, you could be protecting yourself. If this comes to light in an HR investigation and you've been knowingly facilitating policy violations, that puts you at risk. Being forthcoming now demonstrates good faith. This perspective clearly hadn't occurred to Kim. I never thought of it that way. The company has a whistleblower protection policy, Elaine continued, drawing on her compliance background. I've reviewed it. You'd be covered. Kim took a deep breath, then reached into her bag and withdrew a flash drive. I already copied everything. Calendar invites, emails, badge access logs, I pulled from security. I've been feeling terrible about this for months. Elaine accepted the drive, surprised and relieved by Kim's preparedness. Thank you. This won't come back on you, I promise. It's not just about the policy violation, Kim added, her voice stronger now. Mr. Adams, Richard, he was always kind to me, always remembered my birthday, asked about my classes when I was finishing my degree. He doesn't deserve this humiliation. Elaine felt a surprising warmth at this description of Richard, a glimpse of the man he was beyond their shared circumstance. No, she agreed quietly. He doesn't. As Kim left, Elaine texted Richard. Success with assistant. Full documentation obtained. Meeting your security contact tomorrow? His reply came quickly. Confirmed for 4 p.m. Well done. A strange sense of accomplishment filled her. Not vindictiveness, but the satisfaction of competence. Whatever came next, they were reclaiming control of their narratives one step at a time. The security office at Meridian Engineering was tucked away in the basement level, far from the executive floors where Margaret and Jason worked. Richard felt oddly comfortable here. The functional furniture, the wall of monitors, the hum of equipment, all reminded him of his own methodical approach to life. Retirement suits you, observed David Chen, head of security and Richard's former colleague. You look relaxed. Richard managed a wry smile. Appearances can be deceiving. David's expression sobered. So, I gather from your call, you mentioned needing access records? Yes, Richard confirmed, introducing Elaine. For a matter of personal importance. David studied them both, understanding dawning in his eyes. After 20 years in corporate security, He could read between lines. This is about Margaret and Jason Miller. It wasn't a question, but Richard nodded anyway. I've noticed unusual patterns, David continued carefully. Late access to the building, badge-ins that don't align with scheduled meetings. I document everything. It's my job, but hadn't determined if action was warranted. We believe company policy violations have occurred, Elaine explained, her compliance background evident in her precise language. We're gathering documentation for HR. David nodded slowly. I respect you both for handling this professionally rather than other approaches I've seen in similar situations. He turned to his computer, fingers flying across the keyboard. I can provide badge access logs showing them entering the building together after hours when no clients were present. Camera footage from the lobby showing arrival and departure times. Email server metadata showing message exchanges during these periods. That would be extremely helpful, Richard acknowledged. Richard, David said, looking up from his screen, I worked with you for 15 years. You were always fair, always honest. I wouldn't do this for just anyone. I appreciate that, Richard replied quietly. The information I'm providing could be obtained through proper channels with an HR investigation, David clarified. I'm simply expediting access to records that would be discoverable anyway. He downloaded files to a secure drive, then handed it to Richard. Everything is date and time stamped, properly sourced from our security systems. This would stand up to any scrutiny. As they left Meridian, Richard felt a strange mix of emotions. The building had been his professional home for decades. Now he was leaving with evidence that would significantly impact the careers of his wife and her lover. You okay? Elaine asked, noting his expression. Just processing, Richard replied. This is the right course of action, but not one I ever imagined taking. None of us imagined any of this, Elaine reminded him gently. We're just responding to circumstances we didn't create. Richard nodded, appreciating her perspective. Together, they had assembled all the documentation needed for the HR presentation. Messages, calendar manipulation, badge access records, email metadata. The case was irrefutable. We're ready, he said simply as they reached his car. The HR meeting was scheduled for Monday. Today was Friday. One weekend left before everything changed. Patricia Johnson, Director of Human Resources at Meridian Engineering, maintained a neutral expression as she reviewed the documentation before her. Her office, with its muted colors and professional decor, seemed fitting for the gravity of the moment. Let me be clear about our purpose today, Elaine began, her compliance background evident in her structured approach. We're reporting documented violations of Meridian's ethics policies regarding supervisor-subordinate relationships and misuse of company resources. Richard sat quietly beside her, allowing Elaine to lead. They had agreed her background made her the more credible presenter for the HR meeting. These are serious allegations, Patricia noted, particularly given the timing of the annual review cycle. The timing is precisely why we're bringing this forward now, Elaine explained. It would be inappropriate for someone to receive a promotion while under investigation for ethics violations. For the next 20 minutes, Elaine methodically presented their evidence. Badge access records showing after-hours meetings, falsified calendar entries for non-existent client appointments, email exchanges on company servers with inappropriate content, and expense reports claiming business purposes for personal rendezvous. This documentation is extensive, Patricia acknowledged, and appears to establish a clear pattern of policy violation. We've been thorough, Richard spoke for the first time. This isn't about personal grievances. It's about accountability and proper business conduct. Patricia studied him. Mr. Adams, I understand your wife is involved in this situation. Your restraint is notable. This isn't how I wanted to spend my retirement, Richard replied simply. But some principles matter more than comfort. Patricia turned to her computer. Given the documentation provided, I need to initiate our formal investigation protocol immediately. Mr. Miller will be placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. And Margaret Adams? Elaine inquired. The same, Patricia confirmed. Our policy requires removing both parties from the workplace during investigation. She paused, glancing at Richard. You should be aware that they'll be notified today. I understand, Richard said. Thank you for your professionalism. As they left the HR office, Elaine touched Richard's arm. Phase 1 complete. Are you ready for what comes next? Richard nodded, his expression resolute. I've had months to prepare for this moment. Richard was waiting in his home office when Margaret burst through the front door. Her face was flushed, eyes wild with a combination of anger and fear. What have you done? She demanded. I've been suspended pending an ethics investigation. Jason, too. They won't tell us who filed the complaint, but I know it was you. Richard remained seated behind his desk, where he'd arranged 3 items: a folder of evidence, divorce papers, and a framed photo from their 30th anniversary at the Grand Hotel. Hello, Margaret, he said calmly. Yes, it was me, with Elaine Miller's assistance. Margaret's eyes widened. Elaine? Jason's wife? You've been conspiring with her? Not conspiring, Richard corrected. Collaborating. There's a difference. This is about your ego, Margaret accused. You couldn't handle that I found someone who makes me feel alive, so you're trying to destroy my career. No, Richard replied evenly. This is about accountability. You and Jason violated company policies. You falsified business records. You misused company resources. Those are facts, not emotions. We were going to tell you, Margaret insisted, her strategy shifting. After Jason's promotion next week, we didn't want to hurt you unnecessarily. Suite 1214, Richard said quietly. Margaret froze. What? At the Grand Hotel. Our anniversary suite, where you've been meeting Jason for months, where you mocked me as old reliable and laughed about my sentimental attachment to our memories. The color drained from Margaret's face. You read my messages. Yes. Just as you've been researching divorce attorneys and how to maximize claims on my pension. Richard opened the folder, revealing printed copies of her search history. I've documented everything, Margaret. Richard, please. Margaret's tone changed instantly, softening to the voice he'd loved for decades. We can work through this. People make mistakes. 35 years of marriage means I deserved better than this. Richard pushed the divorce papers across the desk. These are fair. More than fair, actually. The beach house goes into a trust for Catherine and future grandchildren. Otherwise, assets are divided equally. Margaret stared at the papers. You've planned all this, while pretending everything was normal. I learned from the best, Richard replied without rancor. 7 months of deception taught me a few things about compartmentalization. And my job? You've destroyed my career. No, Margaret. You did that when you chose to violate company policies. Actions have consequences, something you seem to think wouldn't apply to you. Tears filled her eyes. What about our life together? All these years? Richard finally stood, his voice softening slightly. That's the saddest part. I would have given you anything, including freedom, if you'd asked for it honestly. Instead, you chose cruelty and deception. He picked up the anniversary photo, studying it for a moment before setting it face down. Trust, once broken, reveals character that was always there. I just never saw yours clearly until now. Margaret reached for the divorce papers with trembling hands. What will everyone think? That depends entirely on what you tell them, Richard answered. I won't be broadcasting details to humiliate you. My only concern is maintaining my dignity. The phone calls began that evening. First Susan, Margaret's book club accomplice, her voice tight with discomfort. Richard, I don't know what to say. Margaret told me you found out about everything. Yes, he replied simply, neither accusing nor absolving. I should have said something, Susan continued, guilt evident in her tone. I just didn't want to be the one to. I've known you both for 20 years. You made your choice, Richard interrupted, not unkindly. As did Margaret. As did I. After Susan came their neighbors, then Catherine, their daughter, confused and distressed by her mother's cryptic message about changes at home. Richard maintained the same approach with everyone, dignified honesty without vindictiveness. He confirmed the marriage was ending, but shared no humiliating details. By Sunday, the careful narrative Margaret had attempted to construct, that Richard was controlling, that she deserved happiness, had collapsed under the weight of facts and Richard's consistent dignity. Dad? Catherine's voice came through his phone Sunday evening. Can I come over? I need to understand what's happening. An hour later they sat in the living room, Catherine's engagement ring catching the light as she clutched a tissue. Mom's version keeps changing, she admitted. First you were controlling, then you overreacted to a friendship, then it was about her needing freedom. None of it sounds like the parents I know. Richard chose his words carefully. Your mother and I have different perspectives on what happened. What matters is that you know both of us love you. This doesn't change your wedding plans or our support for you. But why now, after all these years? Sometimes people make choices that force other people's hands, Richard said gently. I didn't choose for the marriage to end, but I did choose how to respond when I learned certain facts. Catherine studied her father's face. You're not telling me everything. No, Richard acknowledged. Some details aren't necessary for you to know. They wouldn't help you and might only hurt. She nodded slowly. Understanding his restraint was itself a form of information. Will you still walk me down the aisle? Wild horses couldn't prevent it, he promised, embracing his daughter. Later that evening, Richard received an unexpected text from Susan. I told Margaret I can't continue covering for her. She's moving to a hotel tomorrow. I'm sorry for my part in all this, Richard. You deserved better from all of us. He didn't reply, but felt a quiet satisfaction that truth had its own momentum once released. Not vengeance, not humiliation, just natural consequences flowing from actions freely chosen. The following day, Richard received confirmation that the HR investigation was proceeding quickly. Jason had been called in for questioning first, followed by Margaret. According to David in security, Jason had attempted to minimize his responsibility, suggesting Margaret had pursued him and leveraged her position on the promotion committee. This betrayal within a betrayal didn't surprise Richard. People who could deceive a spouse of decades would certainly deceive each other when self-preservation required it. As he reviewed the Beach House trust documents his attorney had prepared, Richard felt no joy in these developments, only a solemn recognition that accountability, once set in motion, followed its own path to completion. His engineer's mind had anticipated this outcome. Structural failures, once begun, progressed according to their own logic. What he hadn't anticipated was the strange sense of liberation emerging beneath the pain. For the first time in months, perhaps years, he was living in truth rather than comforting illusion. The foundation might be cracked, but at least now he could see it clearly. 2 weeks after what Richard had come to think of as the reckoning, he sat across from Catherine and her fiancé Michael at a quiet restaurant downtown. The young couple had insisted on this dinner, concerned about him being alone too much. The HR investigation concluded yesterday, Richard informed them when Catherine asked about developments. Jason was terminated for policy violations. Margaret received a formal reprimand and demotion. That seems uneven, Michael observed, his legal background evident in his assessment. Different circumstances, Richard explained. Jason had a prior history of similar violations at his previous company. Margaret was technically the subordinate in the relationship, though her role on the promotion committee complicated matters. "How are you really doing, Dad?" Catherine's concern was evident. Richard considered the question carefully. "I'm recalibrating. 35 years of marriage leaves deep grooves. Sometimes I still reach for my phone to tell Margaret something interesting or turn to share a thought, only to remember our new reality." "That sounds lonely," Catherine said softly. "It is sometimes," Richard acknowledged, "but there's also a certain peace in living without deception. No more gaslighting, no more doubting my own memory or perceptions. And the divorce proceedings? Proceeding smoothly, relatively speaking. Margaret initially contested the beach house trust, but has since agreed to it. The mediator believes we'll finalize everything within 3 months." "And after that?" Michael asked. "Any thoughts about what comes next?" Richard smiled slightly. "Actually, yes. I've been thinking about consulting work. Specialized structural integrity assessments for older buildings. Limited projects, on my own schedule." "That sounds perfect for you," Catherine enthused. "I've also made a friend," Richard added carefully. "Elaine has been understanding, given our shared circumstances." Catherine raised an eyebrow. "Jason's wife? That's unexpected." "Life often is," Richard replied simply. "We've helped each other through a difficult time. Nothing romantic," he clarified. "Just mutual support and respect." As dinner concluded, Catherine hugged him tightly. "I'm proud of you, Dad. The way you've handled all this, with dignity, without bitterness. Not everyone could do that." "The trust documentation is complete," Richard's attorney confirmed, sliding the beach house papers across his desk. "The property is now protected for Catherine and future grandchildren, regardless of your divorce outcome." "Thank you," Richard said, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. This had been his greatest concern, preserving the family gathering place that held so many memories. After leaving the attorney's office, Richard met Elaine at a small cafe that had become their regular meeting spot. Over the past month, their alliance had evolved into a genuine friendship built on mutual respect. "The beach house is secured," he told her, as they settled at their usual corner table. "How did your meeting with the financial advisor go?" "Better than expected," Elaine replied. "Jason's termination actually works in my favor regarding the settlement. His employability is compromised, but since it resulted from his own actions, the court won't penalize me for it." Richard nodded, pleased by her growing confidence in these matters. When they'd first met, Elaine had been uncertain about financial details after decades of leaving them to Jason. Now she spoke with authority about investments and legal considerations. "I've been thinking," she said after a comfortable silence, "about what my therapist calls post-traumatic growth. The idea that after betrayal or loss, we can actually develop new strengths rather than just recover to baseline." That resonates, Richard acknowledged. I wouldn't have chosen this path, but I've discovered capabilities I didn't know I had, a resilience I wasn't sure existed. Exactly, Elaine agreed. I spent 26 years as Jason's wife, mother to his children, supporter of his career. Now I'm rediscovering who Elaine is separately from all those roles. And who is she? Richard asked with genuine interest. Elaine smiled. Still figuring that out, but stronger than she thought, more capable, less willing to settle. There's something I've been meaning to ask, Elaine said, her expression turning serious. The financial documents you helped me understand last week. Would you mind looking at the property assessment forms too? Numbers were always Jason's domain, and I don't trust my interpretation. Of course, Richard agreed. That's well within my wheelhouse. As they reviewed the documents together, Richard felt a quiet satisfaction in using his analytical skills to help someone else navigate uncertainty. There was healing in this, using his strengths not for vengeance, but for support. You know, Elaine said as they finished, a year ago I would have just signed whatever Jason put in front of me, trusting he knew best. The most unexpected gift of this whole painful experience has been learning to trust myself. Trust, Richard repeated thoughtfully. That's really the core of it, isn't it? Trusting ourselves enough to recognize when others have violated our trust, having the courage to act on that knowledge. 6 months after discovering Margaret's betrayal, Richard stood in the reception hall at Catherine's wedding, watching his daughter dance with her new husband. The ceremony had been beautiful. Richard walking Catherine down the aisle with steady steps, Margaret seated respectfully in the front row, the two parents maintaining civil distance for their daughter's sake. She looks radiant, observed Elaine, who had come as Richard's friend and support. She wore a simple blue dress that complemented her natural beauty without seeking attention. Happiest I've seen her, Richard agreed. Despite everything, she got the wedding she wanted. Their divorce had finalized 3 weeks earlier, efficient, relatively amicable, with assets divided fairly. Margaret had ultimately abandoned her attempts to claim part of the beach house, perhaps recognizing the futility of fighting Richard's methodical documentation and reasonable positions. Richard, Margaret approached, nodding politely to Elaine. The photographer wants a picture of Catherine with both of us. Of course, Richard agreed, excusing himself. The photo session was brief, professional. 3 people who once formed a family unit, now reconfigured, but still connected through Catherine. Margaret looked older somehow, the strain of recent months evident despite her careful makeup. You seem well, she said quietly, as the photographer arranged Catherine for another shot. I am, Richard confirmed without elaboration. I never meant, she began, then stopped herself. Well, intentions matter less than actions, don't they? Yes, Richard agreed, surprised by this moment of insight from her. They do. As the reception continued, Richard found himself observing the gathering with new perspective. Friends who had initially been awkward around him now engaged normally. Several had made a point of telling him they admired his handling of a difficult situation. May I have this dance? Richard asked Elaine as the band played a gentle standard from their era. I'd be honored, she replied, rising to join him on the dance floor. They moved together comfortably, 2 people at ease with themselves and each other. Nothing romantic, nothing hurried, just mutual respect and the quiet understanding that comes from shared experience. What's next for you? Elaine asked as they danced. Now that everything is settled legally. Richard considered the question. My consulting business is taking shape. The beach house needs some renovations before summer. Beyond that, he smiled slightly, I'm learning to appreciate unplanned possibilities. That sounds suspiciously like growth, Elaine teased gently. Perhaps, Richard acknowledged, or just wisdom finally catching up with experience. As the song ended, he glanced across the room where Margaret stood watching them, an unreadable expression on her face. Not triumph, not bitterness, just recognition of a chapter closed and a new one begun. Not as he'd planned, but perhaps as it needed to be,